back to our video series on our falling object game. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to use the particle system in Unity to make an explosion effect. So in Unity we need a particle system. So Unity has a great built-in particle generating system that we can use for all sorts of effects. To make a new particle system, we can go right here to our hierarchy and we can create a particle system. That will drop a particle system into our game. You can see it right here in our scene view. Also it's in our camera view. The default particle system is just this one where it's just letting out little glowy bits and they're just moving up the screen. So we're going to go in here and we're going to modify this to make it look like an explosion. First thing, let's go ahead and rename this as explosion. And then over in the inspector here, you'll see that we have this particle system component that we're going to be working with. And there's lots of different settings in here. We can really fully customize this into so many different things. We're going to start here with duration. So duration is how long this particle system emits particles. We're going to turn this down to lower than 5 seconds. All these numbers are in seconds when you type them in here. So let's just make this maybe a 2-second duration. For now we will leave it looping so that we can see what it's doing as we're working on it. Pre-warm here just asks if it should already be pre-generated, so when we have the effect go into the game, when it pops in, that it already is running. We don't need that with an explosion. Start delay will tell us how long to wait or pause before we emit particles. We want particles to happen right away for our explosion. And then start lifetime is how long the particles last, and speed is how fast they move. So we'll get into some of these as we change them. The first thing I want to do though is I want to change how these particles are being emitted. So down here where it says emission, if I click that, that will expand open another little menu, and emission has to do with how the particles are being created. Right now they're being created at 10 particles per second. I actually don't want to emit particles over time, so I'm going to change that to a 0 so now no particles are being emitted. What I want is a burst. A burst is going to make a bunch of particles all at the same time. So to add a burst, I'm going to hit this plus sign over here. Alright, so I've got the particles bursting out, 30 particles every time this thing loops, but they're going straight up the screen right now. So I want to actually have these in a 2D game. I want these to be bursting towards the camera. So I can go down here to where it says shape, and I can change the shape. Right now the shape's a cone. You can see it right here. They're bursting straight up. And a cone actually works fine for a 2D game. Let's actually turn this cone here a little bit so it's facing a different direction. So if I rotate it, if I change rotation on the x-axis to 0, now the particles are bursting towards the camera. Okay, so now you notice that they start here in the center and they spread out. So the cone is now facing the right way. If I go in here, I can also change the angle. So that's how concentrated or spread out I want the particles. I can also change the radius. How tight do I want the center? Right down here in the center is where I'm emitting the particles. So if I pull that in tighter, like to a 0.1, you notice it makes a much more concentrated point. So I'm going to use that for my explosion, because explosions usually have a very tight concentrated starting point and then they spread out. So I'm going to set radius to the 0.01 and the angle can be maybe 25, something like that. You can play with it a little bit to see what you like. We're emitting from the base, which is fine. The rest of this we don't need to worry about right now. There's so many different things we can do in here, so you just kind of learn what pieces you need and you go from there. So we have the shape and we're emitting blasts of particles here now. So I'm going to just collapse these back down now, so we got those how we want them. Alright, let's look at let's give this a little bit longer of a loop time here so we can let these spread out a little bit more. So now this is bursting every 4 seconds. Now, how long do we want these particles to stay around? That's also something we have to decide. Usually an explosion happens and it's usually pretty quick and most of the particles go away pretty fast. So that's where your start lifetime comes in. And what we can do, if we go way over to the right side, these drop down arrows allow us to pick some different settings. So instead of just having all the particles have the same lifetime, I can actually have the computer pick some random lifetimes between a minimum and a maximum time. So if I do that now, some particles are going away right away. Others are waiting for 5 seconds. So I probably don't want them to stick around more than maybe 2 seconds. So let's see what that looks like. And that might even be a little bit too long, but we'll play with it some more. Now that I've shortened that, I'm going to change my loop time down to a 3 here so that I can see that more often. Okay, so you can see, and now I do want them to stick around for a little while, so let's say between 1 second and 2 seconds. And I think 2 seconds is too long. Let's try 1.5. That's a little better. And then maybe we'll have them start winking out at about half a second so that some go away right away. Okay, so that's a little more explosion-like. Okay, we can also play with the speed. This is how fast these particles are traveling. So let's turn this down a little bit more, like to maybe a 2. Now you see at a 2, they're not moving very far off the center. Let's zoom in on here a little bit. So you see they're kind of big and fuzzy there. You can see it up on the screen here, and then they kind of separate a bit as they are disappearing. So I think I like that a little bit more. Now you could also go here and do the random between 2 constants, and I could say, okay, some are going to move at 1, some are going to move maybe as fast as 3, and now you get some random difference. Some particles will move faster than others, and that can give you a little bit more variation. So I think maybe I want to keep this between a 1 and a 2.5. I don't want them to travel too far out here, so I'm going to kind of control the size of the explosion a bit. We can also compare it to the size of our falling object because that's one of the things that will be exploding at some point. So maybe we want the explosion a little bit bigger. It's just kind of a matter of playing with it as you go through. Start size here has to do with how big are the particles when they're created. Right now they're all at a 1. So again, I can go here and drop this arrow down and give a random between 2 constants, and I can say let's have some really tiny particles like at a 0.5. So now I've got some that are smaller, and then maybe we have some big fuzzier particles maybe at a 0.15. So some are big and fuzzy, some are small, and that gives us a little more variety. And then we can go down here and talk about color. So usually we don't just have white explosions. Okay, we can click here in the color bar, and that will allow me to pick a color that will make all the particles the same color, like red, for instance. But you guys know in an explosion that's kind of fiery, there's different shades of colors in there. So again, I can go here and I can say let's pick a random between 2 colors. So now it's picking a random color between white and red. So I could do something like let's do kind of a dark, kind of a red color here, and then let's, for our other color, let's pick kind of a yellowish kind of color here. Okay, maybe that's a little too bright. Let's darken it down a little bit. Or maybe we can lighten it up a little bit more. Just looking for something that looks kind of bright and fiery. Okay, so you can kind of look. Now that red seems like it might be a little too dark, so you can click back there and you can brighten that red up a bit. Maybe make it a little bit more of an orangey red. Take that down a bit. So you can kind of play with it and see the effect that you're getting. Okay, I'm thinking I'm getting a little too much yellow there, so I can maybe darken that yellow a bit, keep it a little more yellow, maybe a little more orangey yellow here. Kind of slide that down a bit. Okay, so something like that is fine. You could also go in and tell it to do a random between 2 gradients, or you could just give it a gradient to work between as well, and then you can kind of control the color values a little bit more there as well. But I've got some color going on here now. I kind of like what that explosion looks like. It looks kind of fiery. So that's what we got so far there. It's looking good. And we do want play on awake to be checked. What will happen is play on awake is checked as soon as I create one of these particle systems. It's going to automatically just go. Okay, so we'll set this once we're done so that it doesn't loop, and every time we make an explosion we'll just get one explosion and it'll go and be done. Okay, so that's kind of a simple explosion. Again, there's so much more we could do in here. There's so many different things that we can control, and there's some really amazing particle effects that people come up with inside of Unity. But we're just kind of going for a simple explosion that we can use in our simple first game here. So there's my particle explosion. I'm going to turn the looping off so that it no longer loops. You can simulate it. If it's not looping, you can hit simulate here. It'll show you what it looks like. It'll just go one time and stop. And so you see that that's kind of what it does. Alright, so now that I made this explosion, what I want to do is I actually want to instantiate or spawn this explosion in every time I have a collision. So we're going to be doing a similar thing that we did for the bullets. Every time I wanted to make a bullet, we hit the space bar and we instantiated the bullet in. We're going to go ahead and instantiate these explosions as well. So if you remember from that, the first thing we need to do is have a master copy of the object that we want to instantiate. And we did that by making a prefab of our bullet. So we're going to do the same for our explosion. So again, we're just going to select our explosion here. And we're going to drag it into our project panel here. And that will cause this to become a prefab. We've just saved a master copy, a prefab of this into our project panel. You notice it turned blue up here in the hierarchy again. That's what prefabs look blue in the hierarchy to tell us it's a prefab. And now that it's saved down here, I can delete it from up here. I don't want just some random explosion going off in my game when I first start the level. So now I've got them saved in my project panel. Alright, so the next thing we want to do then is in our code we have to figure out a place to put this. So we have to think about what point in our game and in our code do we know we've had a collision between a bullet and a falling object. And when that collision occurs, that's when we want to make the explosion happen. So if you think back to what we've been doing on the project, you know that right now in our falling object script we have that function called onTriggerEnter2D. So let's go take a look at that. Let's go to falling object script. So right here we have our onTriggerEnter2D. Remember, this is automatically called by Unity whenever there's a collision with our falling object and something that has a collider on it. Just we set that to a trigger. So, and we get through our variable other here, we get the other object in the collision. We're already checking to see if we collided with a bullet. And if we collided with a bullet, then we are right now just destroying that bullet. But this is where we know that the collision has happened between the falling object and the bullet. This is where we want the explosion to happen. So now that we've identified where the code has to go, because here's where the event is being handled, the collision between the bullet and the falling object, what we can do is we can make ourselves a note here, make explosion here, so we know we want to do it right in here somewhere, and then we just have to set up for it. So let's see, the first thing we need, just like we did with in the player script for making bullets, is we actually need our instantiate command, and we need to know what object are we making a clone of. So we need to make a variable up here to hold that object, our explosion object. So we're going to make a public variable, and we're just going to call this a game object again. And this is going to be our explosion. And then we'll put a little note on here. This is the prefab of the explosion particle system. So there we go. And let's kind of line that up a little bit. Okay, and we'll make a space here just for readability. So now we have that there. So let's save our script, and let's go ahead and get that linked in through the inspector here before we do anything else. So we'll go back into Unity here, and we will go to our falling object. And in the falling object script, I've made this variable explosion that can hold the game object. So I'm going to go grab my explosion prefab. Make sure you grab the prefab out of the project panel. Drag and drop that right there. So now I've got a link to the explosion. Now that my script here knows what the explosion is, I can use it down here where I want to make the explosion. So our command again was instantiate. And then the first thing we need is the object. So I just did that. That's my explosion. Explosion. and then I need to tell it where to make the explosion. So I want the explosion to happen at the point of impact. Okay, I want to know where that impact happened. So I'm going to just put it at the position of my falling object at the time that we had this collision. And since this onTriggerEnter 2D runs the very same frame that the collision happens, I know it happens right here at this spot where this happened. So I'm going to feed in the transform dot position of the falling object, and then I'm going to give it a rotation. So same thing we did before, transform dot rotation of my object. Okay, and it looks like I've got a spelled explosion wrong here. Let's get that spelled right so that it EXPLOSION, explosion. There we go. So now it's going to make an explosion. It's going to position it where the falling object is right now and at the rotation that it is right now. Now, if you're more experienced in coding here, you've seen that we've got a bit of an issue here. Because if I was to run this right now, let's see what happens. And let's see if you can predict what the problem might be here. So if I hit play, oops, I can't even see my player. Here we go. So now let's see if I can shoot this guy. If I shoot him, there he is. Now, did you see any explosions happen? You didn't, but if you look here in the hierarchy, you'll notice that we did make some explosions. Alright, so let's zoom out here a little bit and see where those explosions are. So let's see if we can hit one of these guys again. Watch in the scene view. Okay, now do you see where the explosions are happening in the scene view? Let me pause this for a second. Oops, I didn't catch it. You can see a little bit right here. It's happening up here at the top. So why is that? Okay, we're hitting it maybe down here, but it's not making the explosion until it's up at the top of the screen. Well, that's because our friend the computer here does things in the order we tell it to. And we told it before making the explosion here to move the falling object back to the top of the screen. So it's going here and it's moving us back to 17 on the Y. So it is making the explosion after we move the object. We actually want to do the explosion first and then move the object. So I'm going to just cut this from here and just move it down here. So let's go ahead and make sure that the first thing we do is check if it's a bullet, and if it is, we'll make sure we make our explosion, and then we'll move the object. So if I make that simple change there, you'll see that now we get a more realistic, what we expected kind of thing happening here. Let's see if I can shoot him. So see how the explosion happened right there? So now the explosions are happening right at the point of impact, and because we're making it explode and disappear at the same time, it looks a little more realistic that this thing would disappear because of course it exploded. Okay, so now I can just sit here and keep hitting these guys. Now, the other thing you'll notice over here in the hierarchy is every time I hit this, I'm getting a new explosion. So these are all new game objects that are popping into my scene. And once we use them, they're never going to be used again. So they start to clutter up our hierarchy. They're also going to be held in system memory. So they're going to, after a while, if we had enough of these, it could maybe cause us a problem with performance and clogging up our memory. So we're going to want to find a way to have these guys go away after they've been made. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can make these explosions just destroy themselves after they've been created. So back in our code here, if we actually store this new object that we're instantiating in a temporary variable, then we can actually give it some commands. So let's see if we can do a game object variable here. So let's make a game object called explode, and let's set it equal to our instance here, our instantiation. So when this object is made, we want to store it in this game object variable, and that'll happen here now. So let's just see if it likes what I typed here. Let's see if it does it. Okay, so it seems to not be giving me an error, so that's good. So let's see now if we capture this, then what we can do is, after we've made it and captured it under the name explode, now we can tell this particular explosion that happened right now, this instance of an explosion, what to do. So if you remember, we have this command called destroy. Now I could say destroy explode dot game object. Okay, so I can tell it now, hey, this game object that I just made, I could probably not just leave off the dot game object here as well. Let's see if that works, because this is a game object. So if I say destroy explode, let's see if it does it like I expect it to here. I always want to test yourself out, see if you get it right. So let's shoot this guy, and oh, you notice now that it's being destroyed as soon as it's being created. So it's getting rid of it, but now it's not actually giving it enough time to play. Okay, so that solved our one problem and opened up another one, which happens lots when we're making code. So the destroy command actually has another part to it. If I put what I want to destroy and then put a comma, it now tells me that I can give it a float called t. And t is the amount of time to delay before destroying this object. So I can put a little delay here, a little self-destruct countdown, if you will, after this. It's in seconds. So I know that I set my explosion, my lifetime on my object, on my particles, is no bigger than 2. So why don't we just give it a 2, and the F here is because this is a float number, so I have to tell it this is a float by putting the F there. So if I say 2F, then it will wait 2 seconds, and then it will destroy. So when this is created and put on the screen, right away we're setting a 2-second countdown self-destruct timer on it, and then it will destruct itself after 2 seconds. Let's see if that's enough time in our game to look right. So let's play and see if I can hit this first one, and there, and yes, that looked pretty good. I think there was enough time for it to totally play the explosion. Yep, there we go. See, it's got plenty of time to play out my whole explosion, and then they're popping out of the hierarchy. They're no longer here anymore because they are being destroyed, and now they're not going to be cluttering up our memory or our hierarchy, and that's just a good way to clean up after ourselves as we're coding. Alright, so there you go. We have looked at how to make a particle system explosion, and also then how to cause that explosion to happen by using instantiate, and then we've looked at how to clean up after ourselves so that we don't have a bunch of just spent explosions sitting in our hierarchy. So that's enough for this video. In the next video, we'll look at adding some sound here to our game. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know, and I hope you enjoyed watching.